The twin suns of Callisto Station cast long shadows across the salvage fields, turning mountains of discarded spacecraft into monuments of rust and fading dreams. Dante Cross stood atop a collapsed transport freighter, his weathered hands shielding his eyes as he surveyed the endless expanse of mechanical corpses. At 34, his face already bore the marks of too many years, under harsh alien sun's deep lines around his eyes, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, and the perpetual stubble of someone who'd forgotten what leisure time felt like. The settlement of Callisto Station wasn't much to look at. Built in the shadow of a failed terraforming project, it attracted the desperate, the criminal, and the stubborn. Dante fell into the last category. He'd come here 5 years ago, after his contract with the Colonial Engineering Corps ended badly something. About creative differences with management, though the truth involved a supervisor's broken nose and Dante's principled refusal to cut corners on life support systems. Now he made his living pulling valuable components from the wreckage that accumulated in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. It was honest work, if lonely. Most days, he preferred the company of dead machines to living beings. Machines didn't lie, didn't betray, didn't leave. But today, something felt different. Dante's practiced eye caught movement in the shadow of a crashed passenger liner, its hull split open like a broken egg. His hand instinctively moved to the plasma cutter at his belt. Not every scavenger in these parts respected territorial boundaries. But this movement was wrong. Too fluid, too graceful for the usual thugs who occasionally tried to claim his finds. He made his way down carefully, boots finding purchase on twisted metal and shattered composite panels. The heat of the afternoon pressed down like a physical weight, and sweat trickled down his spine beneath his work-stained shirt. As he approached the liner, he heard it, a soft sound, almost musical, like wind chimes made of crystal. Dante froze. He knew that sound, Valerian. But what would one of them be doing here, in this wasteland? He rounded the edge of the hull breach and stopped dead. She was huddled in the deepest shadow the wreckage could offer, her slender form wrapped in what had once been elegant robes, but now hung in tatters. Even in distress, there was something ethereal about her. Valerians were known across the galaxy for their beauty, but seeing one in person was different from the holidays. Her skin held a faint opalescent quality, and even in the dim light, he could see the bioluminescent markings that traced delicate patterns along her arms and neck currently pulsing a deep, distressed purple. Her eyes met his, and Dante saw fear war with defiance in their violet depths. She was injured. He could see the dark stains spreading across her side, where the robes clung to her body. Without thinking, he raised both hands, palms out. "Easy," he said softly, though he had no idea if she understood Standard. "I'm not going to hurt you." She flinched anyway, pressing herself harder against the bulkhead. The bioluminescent marks flared brighter, a warning display he'd read about but never witnessed. Up close, she was breathtaking high cheekbones, silver-white hair that seemed to move with a life of its own, and those expressive eyes that held more emotion than any words could convey. Dante slowly crouched down, making himself less threatening. He pointed to her wound, then to himself, then made a rapping motion. Her eyes narrowed, processing. Valerians were supposed to be incredibly intelligent, their minds processing information in ways that left most other species struggling to keep up. After a long moment, she gave the smallest nod, Doc, moving carefully. Dante approached. This close, he could see she was trembling, whether from pain, fear, or the heat, he couldn't tell. Probably all three. Valerians were adapted to cooler climates, and Callisto Station's binary suns were notoriously brutal. He shrugged off his work jacket, revealing the tank top beneath, and draped it over her shoulders. She started at the gesture, confusion flickering across her features. "Shade," he explained, miming pulling it over her head. For protection. She understood. As she adjusted the jacket, he got his first clear look at her wound. Plasma burn, and recent. Someone had shot her. The anger that flared in his chest surprised him with its intensity. He pulled his emergency med kit from his belt. Everyone who worked the salvage fields carried one and held it up for her to see. "This will help," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand, but hoping his tone conveyed his intent. Her violet eyes searched his face for a long moment. Then, with visible effort, she spoke. Her voice was like nothing he'd ever heard melodic, layered with harmonics that made standard sound clumsy in comparison. "Please," she whispered, the single word heavily accented but unmistakable. Dante's hands were surprisingly gentle as he worked. The medical foam would seal the wound and promote healing, but she needed more than first aid. She needed shelter, water, proper rest. As he finished bandaging her, he sat back on his heels and really looked at her. There was a story here, and probably not a good one. Valerians didn't end up in places like Callisto Station by choice. She was watching him with those remarkable eyes, and he could practically see her weighing her options. Trust the strange human or take her chances alone in the wasteland. It wasn't much of a choice. "I have a place," Dante said slowly, gesturing toward the distant cluster of structures that marked the inhabited zone. "Safe, water, food." He pointed to each word's corresponding action. She studied him for so long, he thought she might refuse. Then, with visible effort, she pushed herself to her feet. She swayed, and Dante quickly stood to steady her. The moment his hands touched her arms, he felt a strange tingle, not unpleasant, just different. The bioluminescent marks under his fingers flared briefly to a soft blue. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, but her first step proved her wrong. Her legs buckled, and Dante caught her before she could fall. For a moment, they stayed frozen in that awkward embrace. She was lighter than he expected, and despite everything, he caught a faint scent like ozone and something floral. "Right," he muttered, "Plan B." Before she could protest, he carefully scooped her into his arms. She stiffened, those violet eyes going wide with alarm, but she was too weak to resist. Dante shifted her weight, settling her against his chest. Through the thin fabric of her ruined robes, he could feel how her skin was almost cool to the touch, another Valerian trait. "It's not far," he assured her, starting the trek back toward his dwelling. "You're safe now." As he walked, she gradually relaxed against him, her head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder. The bioluminescent patterns on her visible skin slowly shifted from purple to a cautious blue-green. Dante didn't know much about Valerian color communication, but he hoped it meant she was starting to feel secure. The path through the salvage fields was one he could walk blindfolded. Past the colony of crashed mining vessels, around the mountain of stripped engine cores, through the canyon of compressed hull plating. The suns were beginning their slow descent toward the horizon, and the temperature would drop mercifully in another hour. Other scavengers saw them, but didn't approach. Dante had a reputation for being tough but fair, and most people in the settlement knew better than to cross him. Still, he saw the looks, the whispers that would no doubt spread by nightfall. A human carrying a wounded Valerian through the salvage fields. That would be the talk of every drinking hole in Callisto Station by morning. His dwelling came into view, a converted cargo container he'd spent 2 years making livable. It wasn't much, a single room with a sleeping area, a tiny kitchenette, and a workshop space, but it was clean, secure, and most importantly, climate-controlled. He'd built that cooling system himself, using salvaged parts from a luxury yacht. Dante managed to get the door open while still holding her, and kicked it shut behind them. The cool air inside made her sigh with relief. Those violet eyes opened, looking around with undisguised curiosity. He carried her to his bunk, the only real furniture he had, and laid her down carefully. She looked impossibly delicate against his rough bedding, like something from a dream that had wandered into his harsh reality. "Water," he said, moving to his small conservation unit. He poured a cup and brought it to her, helping her sit up enough to drink. She took small sips, watching him the entire time with an intensity that made him uncomfortably aware of how close they were. When she'd had enough, he set the cup aside and checked her bandage. The medical foam was doing its job, but she'd need to rest, really rest, for it to be effective. Dante ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware that he now had a mysterious, wounded alien woman in his bed, and absolutely no plan for what came next. She spoke again, that musical voice filling his small space with unexpected beauty. He couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear in her eyes. In the way her hand slowly reached out to touch his arm, where he sat on the edge of the bunk. "Thank you." Dante covered her hand with his own, feeling that strange tingle again where their skin connected. "You can stay here," he said quietly. "As long as you need. I don't know what you're running from, but you're safe now. I promise." Whether she understood his words or just his tone, something in her expression softened. The bioluminescent marks shifted to a warm amber color, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like hope flickered in those remarkable eyes. As darkness fell over Callisto Station, Dante sat in his workshop corner, ostensibly organizing tools, but mostly watching the sleeping figure in his bunk. He'd picked up plenty of salvage in his years here, but this was the first time he'd rescued a person. And despite the complications, he knew this would bring the questions, the authorities, the danger. He couldn't bring himself to regret it. There was something about her, something that called to a part of him he'd thought he'd buried years ago. The part that wanted to build instead of just survive, to protect instead of just endure, to connect instead of just exist. Tomorrow, he'd figure out the details. Tonight, for the first time in a long time, his dwelling didn't feel quite so empty. Outside, the stars emerged in Callisto Station's thin atmosphere, brilliant and cold and infinite. But inside the converted cargo container, something warm was beginning to take root. Something neither of them had expected to find in this wasteland of broken dreams and forgotten machines. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Morning arrived with the harsh glare of twin suns streaming through the single window of Dante's dwelling. He woke in his workshop chair, neck protesting the awkward angle he'd slept in. For a moment, confusion clouded his mind. Why had he slept in the chair? Then memory flooded back, and his eyes immediately went to the bunk. She was awake, sitting up carefully, those violet eyes watching him with cautious curiosity. In the morning light filtering through his window, the bioluminescent patterns on her skin had faded to barely visible traces, like watermarks on silk. Her silver white hair, despite everything she'd been through, somehow still held an otherworldly elegance. "Morning," Dante said, his voice rough with sleep. He stood slowly, letting her see his movements, still careful not to startle her. "How's the wound?" She tilted her head, clearly not understanding, but when he pointed to her side, she looked down and carefully touched the medical foam bandage. She spoke in her melodic language, the words flowing like a song, then seemed frustrated when he couldn't comprehend. Dante moved to his small kitchenette, giving her space while he prepared something resembling breakfast. Protein bars, reconstituted fruit, and most importantly, water. Clean water was precious on Callisto Station, but he had a good filtration system, another salvage project that had taken months to perfect. He brought the tray over, setting it on the small table beside the bunk. She looked at the offerings with interest and glanced at him questioningly. Dante picked up one of the protein bars and took a bite, demonstrating. A small smile curved her lips, the first he'd seen from her, and she carefully selected a piece of reconstituted fruit. The moment it touched her tongue, Her eyes widened with pleasure. The bioluminescent marks flickered a bright, happy gold. Dante found himself smiling back, something warm unfurling in his chest at her delight over something so simple. They ate in companionable silence, communicating through gestures and expressions. When she'd finished, Dante cleared the dishes and then stood awkwardly, trying to figure out how to explain what he needed to do today. He couldn't just abandon his salvage work. He had contracts to fulfill, parts to deliver. But he also couldn't leave her here alone, still healing, in a place she didn't know. The decision was made for him by a harsh pounding on his door. Dante's expression hardened immediately. He knew that aggressive knock. Holding up a hand to signal she should stay quiet, he moved to the door and opened it just enough to block the view inside. Broker Vendix stood outside, his bulk filling the doorway. The Krolix was a hulking creature, all muscle and attitude, with gray-green scaled skin and small, calculating eyes. He wore the unofficial uniform of Callisto Station's housing authority, a mismatched collection of salvaged armor pieces that somehow managed to look both ridiculous and threatening. Cross, Vendix rumbled, his standard thick with his species' guttural accent. Interesting rumors floating around the settlement this morning. Something about you bringing home a pretty alien girl. Don't know what you're talking about, Dante said flatly. And I'm busy. Vendix's lipless mouth curved into what might have been a smile. That's unfortunate. Because if you were harboring an unregistered alien, you'd need to report to the housing authority within 24 hours. Fill out residency applications, pay the processing fees, submit to health screenings. He leaned closer, and Dante caught a whiff of his sour breath. Failure to do so results in immediate eviction and confiscation of assets, both yours and whoever might be staying with you. Dante's jaw clenched. How much? Excuse me? Cut the bureaucratic garbage, Vendix. How much to make this go away? The Krolix's eyes gleamed with avarice. 3,000 credits. Standard processing. That's triple the usual fee. Valerians are a special case. Vendix's smile widened. Exotic. Valuable. If you can't afford her residency, I'm sure there are others in the station who'd be happy to take on her ... registration. The threat was clear. Dante's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. Breaking Vendix's face would feel good for about 10 seconds, after which he and Desha would be thrown out into the salvage fields with nothing. I'll have your money, Dante said through gritted teeth. But I need time. You have 3 days. After that, she becomes station property, and you lose your dwelling rights for harboring an illegal alien. Vendix turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Cross? Don't try anything stupid. I've got people watching. After the door closed, Dante stood there for a long moment, fighting the urge to put his fist through the wall. 3,000 credits. He had maybe 800 saved up, which meant he needed to pull off the biggest salvage score of his career in 72 hours. A soft touch on his arm made him turn. She'd gotten out of bed despite her injury, moving silently across the small space. Those violet eyes searched his face, and even though they couldn't speak, she understood something was wrong. The bioluminescent marks pulsed with concern a muted blue-gray. It's nothing, Dante lied. But she saw right through it. She placed her hand over his heart, then over her own, then gestured between them and to the door where Vendix had stood. Her meaning was clear. This threat was about both of them. Dante sighed and gently guided her back to the bunk. You need to rest. That wound won't heal if you keep moving around. He rummaged through his storage until he found an old datapad with a translation program outdated and glitchy, but it might help. He handed it to her and made typing motions. Understanding lit her features. She took the datapad and, after a moment of familiarizing herself with the interface, began to type. The translator was slow, but eventually text appeared on the screen. Name, Visha. Thank you for sanctuary. Dante, he said, pointing to himself. Then, more quietly, you're welcome. She typed again. I bring danger. I am sorry. Not your fault, Dante assured her. He considered trying to explain the housing authority's corruption through the translator, but decided against it. Instead, he just said, I'll handle it. But I need to work today. Will you be okay here alone? Vesha's fingers moved across the datapad. I stay. I wait. Please be careful. Something about those simple words, the genuine concern in her eyes, made Dante's chest tighten. It had been so long since anyone had worried about whether he came home safe. Before he could second-guess himself, he reached out and gently tucked a strand of her silver hair behind her ear. Her skin was cool and impossibly soft beneath his calloused fingertips. The bioluminescent marks where he touched her flared briefly to a warm amber, and he felt that strange tingle again. I'll be back before dark, he promised. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me. She nodded, understanding even without translation. As Dante gathered his tools and prepared to leave, he showed her where he kept extra food and water, how to adjust the climate control if she got too warm, and where his emergency medical supplies were stored. She watched everything intently, those clever eyes absorbing information down at the door. He paused and looked back. She sat on his bunk, wrapped in one of his clean shirts that hung on her slight frame like a tent, her silver hair catching the morning light, and something fierce and protective surged through him. In less than 24 hours, this stranger had somehow become someone he'd fight for. Stay safe. Vesha, he said softly. Her fingers moved on the datapad. You too. Dante. The salvage fields felt different today, charged with urgency. Dante pushed deeper into the wreckage than he usually dared, looking for high-value components. He needed plasma regulators, intact power cores, or if he was incredibly lucky, one of the rare quantum processors that sometimes survived ship crashes. Those alone could fetch 1,000 credits from the right buyer. Hours blurred together as he worked. The twin suns climbed toward their zenith, turning the metal landscape into a blinding furnace. Sweat poured down his face and back, soaking through his shirt. His hands bled from a dozen small cuts, the price of hasty work, but he didn't slow down. By late afternoon, he'd accumulated a decent haul, 3 plasma regulators, a mostly intact navigation array, and various smaller components. Maybe 1,500 credits worth, if he could find buyers quickly. Not enough, but a start. He was extracting a promising-looking power coupling when he heard footsteps on metal. Dante's hand went to his plasma cutter, but he relaxed when he recognized the approaching figure. Myra Hong picked her way through the debris with the careful grace of someone who'd been working salvage as long as Dante had. She was a few years older, her black hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a practical braid. A network of scars decorated her brown arms, testaments to decades of dangerous work. She'd been one of the few people who'd befriended Dante when he first arrived at Callisto Station. You look like hell, she observed, settling onto a stable piece of hull plating. Heard you had an interesting visitor yesterday. Dante didn't look up from his work. News travels fast. It does when that news involves a Valerian woman and a certain broker making threats. Myra pulled out a canteen and took a long drink. Vendix came by my place this morning. Wanted to know if I'd seen anything. I told him I don't stick my nose in other people's business. Thanks. Don't thank me yet. I'm here to tell you you're an idiot. When Dante finally looked at her, she sighed. 3,000 credits, Dante. Even if you work yourself to death for 3 days, you won't make that much. Not in time. I have to try. You don't know this girl? She's not your responsibility. Dante was quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something he didn't fully understand himself. When I found her, Mira, she was hurt and alone and terrified. And the first thing I thought was, I have to help her. Not because of who she is or what species, but because she needed help, and I could give it. He met his friend's eyes. When did we become the kind of people who turn away from that? Myra studied him, then shook her head with a rueful smile. Still got that hero complex, I see. The cores really should have beaten that out of you. They tried. She laughed, then grew serious. Look, I can't give you the full amount, but I've got about 400 credits saved up. It's yours if you need it. Dante felt his throat tighten. Myra, I can't. Yes, you can. Consider it an investment in my faith that there are still decent people in this garbage heap of a station. She stood, brushing off her pants. Besides, I'm curious about this Valerian who's got you working yourself into an early grave. Bring her by some time. I'll teach her which humans are worth knowing. After Myra left, Dante worked with renewed energy. By the time the suns began their descent, his haul had grown considerably. He loaded everything into his salvage cart and began the trek back to his dwelling, already mentally calculating which buyers would give him the best prices and which he could hit up tonight. The door to his dwelling opened before he could key in his code. Vesha stood there, backlit by the warm glow of his internal lights, and the sight of her hit him like a physical force. She'd cleaned up, somehow managing to work miracles with his basic sanitation system. Her hair was damp and flowing loose around her shoulders, and she wore one of his shirts like a dress, cinched at the waist with a piece of cord. The medical bandage was still in place, but she moved with less pain. Dante, she said, his name accented but clear. She must have been practicing. He set down his salvage cart and stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind him. You're supposed to ask who it is before opening the door. She held up the datapad, showing text she'd already prepared. I knew it was you. I can feel when you are near. Something about that simple statement made his heart race. Before he could respond, she was typing again. You are hurt. Your hands. He looked down at his bloodied, cut-up hands, suddenly aware of how they must look. Hazard of the job. It's nothing. Vesha's bioluminescent marks flashed with distress, a deep indigo. She took his hands in her cooler ones, examining the damage with concern. Then, moving with purpose, she guided him to sit while she retrieved his medical supplies dot for the next 20 minutes. She carefully cleaned and treated each cut, her touch impossibly gentle. Dante watched her work, marveling at her focus, the way her silver hair fell forward to partially hide her face, the subtle shift of colors across her skin as she concentrated. When she finished, she looked up at him, and their faces were suddenly very close. Thank you, he said softly. She typed on the datapad with one hand while still holding one of his. You save me. I help you. This is balance. It's more than that, Dante said, surprising himself with his honesty. At least, it's becoming more than that. Vesha's violet eyes widened slightly. The bioluminescent marks shifted to that warm amber again, pulsing gently. She set down the datapad and very carefully reached up to touch his face. Her cool palm against his bearded cheek sent that electric tingle through him. Stronger than before, they sat like that for a long moment. The salvage work forgotten, the debt forgotten, everything forgotten except the strange connection growing between them. Vesha's fingers traced the scar through his eyebrow, then down along his jaw. Her expression held wonder, as if she was discovering something precious. Dante turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to her palm. She gasped softly, her whole body seeming to light up from within, the bioluminescent patterns blazing brilliant gold. He could see her pulse racing in her throat, see the way her breath had quickened. Is this okay? He asked quietly, even though he wasn't sure she'd understand. But she did. Vesha nodded, leaning closer, and when their lips met, it was like touching a live wire. The kiss was gentle, exploratory, both of them learning this new language between them. Her lips were cool and impossibly soft, and he could taste something sweet, like honey and starlight. When they parted, both breathing harder, Vesha's entire upper body glowed with golden light, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. She looked dazed, wonderstruck, and Dante felt exactly the same way. She reached for the datapad with shaking hands. In my culture, light shows truth. I cannot hide what I feel. I glow for you. You're beautiful, Dante said, not caring if she understood the words. She'd understand the tone, the look in his eyes, and she did. Her smile was radiant, transforming her already lovely face into something that took his breath away. She typed again. I was lost. You gave me shelter. Now you give me something more. Something I never expected to find so far from home. What's that? Dante asked, though he thought he knew. Her answer appeared on the screen. Hope, and maybe. Beginning of love. The words hung between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Dante pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her healing wound, and held her close. She nestled against his chest, her cool skin a pleasant contrast to his warmth, and they stayed like that as darkness fell over Callisto Station. Tomorrow he'd sell his salvage, work harder, find a way to make up the money Vendix demanded. Tomorrow he'd fight for the right to keep this woman safe, to give her the home she deserved. But tonight, in this moment, they had each other. And somehow, despite the impossible odds and uncertain future, that felt like enough. The SSI, a single quote's S-hand found his, their fingers interlacing. The bioluminescent patterns where they touched pulsed with warm, golden light, a promise written in living luminescence on her skin. Whatever came next, they'd face it together.